Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Apologies for the background noise with my venue today. I'm very pleased to have all of you here. I can't say how excited I am to have received all of you consistently all through this week. And today is the grand finale, if I have to put it that way. Thank you very much for joining the session. And as you already know, the other sessions we've had has been a build up to this specific session tonight, where we are going to be graded. So I believe that everything else we've learned from other trainers um, is going to count in the sort of discussions that we are going to have tonight. My name is Eze. I'm sure you already know that by now. From Rhetorics Nigeria, and this program has been in partnership this year with the Belgrade WUDC Arch Core, and we are so excited to have received their support and also received two members of the Arch Core to join us in this edition. It is our hopes that with the videos that we have also uploaded, that even people who have not registered for this year's training would be able to find available resources for adjudication, because I think that is in short supply within the circuit as well. So we want to thank everyone who has been a part of the project even from 2020 up until now. Great. So tonight we have our final and very special guest. Um, I'm just going to do a quick recap of her CV. Juanita is a law student at Universidad del Rosario in Bogota, Colombia. Well, just know that she's from University of Rosario. I'm sure that's what it means. She's a three-time WUDC EFL finalist, and she was the best EFL speaker for WUDC 2020, as well as the champion and best speaker of CMUDE 2019. Um, Juanita has been in the finals or among top speakers or more than 20 tournaments across Latin America. As a judge, she has broken at over 40 tournaments, including Korea WUDC, Cambridge Ivy, Yale Ivy, and LSE Open. She has been on the CA team of over 40 tournaments, including the CMUDE 2020, ABP 2021, Oxford Ivy 2021, and she would also be a deputy chief adjudicator for the World University Debating Championship 2022. She's going to be leading us today on a guided analysis of a debate. I think we have also shared that with you guys previously. We're very excited to have you, Juanita. Thank you for taking out time out of your very busy schedule to join us. And the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm really happy to be here. I think it's very important to acknowledge the importance of training to be a good judge. I think also because the importance that we have in judging, but also because learning how to be a good judge oftentimes helps us a lot into becoming better speakers and understanding better how to deal with debates. So I think this is going to be a very rewarding experience for all of you. And I hope that this guided analysis or assessment of a debate is going to be rewarding for you, or you can learn something from it. So before starting with the discussion on the debate that we sent you beforehand for you to analyze, I think it's very important for us to have in mind, but I'm sure you already know it, but for us to be on common ground here, I think it's very important for us to cover what's important when you're judging a debate, and especially what's important when you're doing a panel discussion in a debate, or you're a panelist in a panel discussion. Why is this important? It is important because I am going to be sort of the chair of this discussion. Therefore, I'm going to ask you some questions, and it is important for you then to know what should be the role of a panelist in order for us to have a common ground of how we should contribute to this panel discussion. So on a first basis, it is important to acknowledge that when you are intervening in a panel discussion, you should not be doing a summary of the debate. It is not expected from you as a panelist to be doing a play-by-play of the debate. It is not expected for you to do a chronological explanation of what has been happening in the debate, whereas what is expected from you is acknowledging or positing the key interactions that have been happening within the debate, and for you to have an active assessment of those interactions, which ultimately means that it is not important for you to like know everything that has been said. Probably everybody knows it, probably everybody has taken notes of it, but whereas it is important for you to acknowledge what of what has been said is important and is key to analyzing who is winning the debate and who is more persuasive than others in terms of comparing teams. The second thing is in terms of how to do that assessment. There are two key parts of analysis or two key things to bear in mind when you're assessing the contributions of a team or a speaker in a debate, which is first the arguments that they make, and second, the rebuttal they make at the same time. Ultimately, when you're assessing arguments, you have to assess how well are they constructed or how substantiated are they, which ultimately means how many mechanisms or how much explanation does the argument have, and what are the impacts, or why is it that those mechanisms are important, how that contributes to the debate, or how that persuades you that something is going to happen or not in the situation that is being debated about. The second thing is assessing rebuttal, which ultimately is the responses we get from other teams in order to assess how likely are those teams' responses and how they interact with the arguments that have already been said within the debate. How to assess a rebuttal? It is important for you to acknowledge that not all rebuttals do the same thing within a debate. When you're assessing rebuttal, it is important for you to acknowledge that it is likely that rebuttal might make an argument false, or not, or you're convinced then that something is not going to happen, or a rebuttal can mitigate an argument, which ultimately means that the argument is not false, which ultimately means that the things that the other team are arguing might happen, but you're persuaded that it is unlikely that they would happen, which ultimately means that the argument is mitigated or the argument is not as relevant as it was before. And lastly, what a rebuttal can do is to persuade you that even if something happens, it's not as bad or not as important in comparison with what the other team is arguing, which ultimately means that what the rebuttal is doing is prioritizing an argument over the other. Those are the three things that you can do for rebuttal. And ultimately then what you have to assess as a judge is, what is that rebuttal doing with the other argument? Is that rebuttal effective? Is that rebuttal persuasive? And ultimately, what is the impact it is going to have to the contributions made by the team the rebuttal is attacking? With those things buried in mind, I think it's very important for us to take a few minutes. I guess you have seen the debate. I guess you brought your notes of the debate you have seen. And basically the idea now is for you to gather your thoughts on that debate that you have already watched, that you have already assessed, that to gather your ideas, to be able to comprehend which are those key aspects. And then I think it's very important for you to start thinking, and I think this is important to tackle any discussion when participating in judging a BP debate, which ultimately is asking yourself, what are the clash points that have happened within the debate and how each team contributes to those clash points, which you think and why is the most important clash point. So let's take 3 minutes to look at our notes and outline those key aspects of the debate or the contributions that each team made, the 3 or 2 clash points that you found were relevant within or throughout all the debate, and then an idea of what clash point was the most important one. So let's sort of take 3 minutes to look at our notes, and then, as I always say, we'll have a chat about what you saw and what you assessed in the debate. Okay, so let's start off with, this is something that it's not always done and should not always be done during a deliberation, but as this is like a guided analysis of the debate, we're going to do so. So I want to first have a chat with you guys about which are the main clash points that you found in the debate. So I don't know if you want to raise your hands or simply unmute yourselves to contribute to that question. Okay, so Obilio?
Okay, so good evening. Good evening. I guess you can hear me clearly, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the main clashes I found in the debate was the clash on moral obligation.
Mm-hmm.
Why should we, the consumers, care enough? Right? It became a very important question in this debate. If you're talking about boycotting, this fashion houses, this fashion industry, like mid-level fashion industries that are doing the whole massive production and all that. And the government is talking about, the whole hypocrisy that lies within citizens of the first world country, how they do not extend that level of care when it comes to real things like child labor and issues around the process in the production of these things they really love, like clothes and all that. Now, the big question I think that kept on ringing to the entire house that I felt got some level of clarity from closing was, why should these guys who are in the first world country care enough to boycott? What's the moral obligation on them? Beyond saying, we should care about those people, beyond the whole argument from Uju, first of all, that was about why it's important to care, the question kept on rigmaroling around the houses. Why will they care, right? So beyond why is moral obligation a thing to be considered, the next thing there was, why will they, on the grounds of what moral obligation necessarily is, act on the grounds of that? So moral obligation was a very big issue, a very big clash from both the opening and the closing half of this argument. While I wouldn't be talking about, who I think won on that case, but I think that's a very key clash.
Okay, thank you very much, Obilio. So to summarize, basically, you think there is a clash in a moral obligation, but not only there exists a moral obligation, but secondly, if actually it should be, or it is in fact on the interest of these individuals to care about, or to care to some extent about that moral obligation.
Exactly.
Okay, amazing. Thank you very much, Obilio. I do agree with you. I think there is a huge clash here about moral obligations and to what extent that is something that people should be caring about. Other clash points, perhaps. Imole, you raised your hand.
Yeah, good evening. Azumi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So for me, apart from moral obligation that Obiyo mentioned, I feel like a big clash for me was exploitation. This was something that we saw raised from the opening government, and it ran through the entire debate up until closing opposition. Okay, I wouldn't necessarily say who I felt did best, but I think that clash on exploitation was really, really great, where we had government bench trying to prove how they want to reduce exploitation and make sure that workers are well treated, and opposition telling us, oh, well, maybe exploitation is not such, it does exist, but probably it's not such a bad thing, or, oh, exploitation is going to be worse in government world. I feel like that's something that kept going back and forth within the debate, and it was really important for the debate.
Yeah, I do agree with you, Imole. Thank you very much. But I wouldn't pose it as just exploitation. But I think the clash point was more about if the measure of boycotting was going to be effective towards eliminating exploitation, which is basically what you said. We have government arguing that through boycott, it is likely that we're going to end up solving exploitation or giving people better situations that they had before. And then we have opposition saying that this is in the comparison better than what they would do if they did not have these jobs, or as we see in CO and we're going to review shortly later, there is a discussion on if it would be worse if they could not buy or they could not sell to people from the first world. So yeah, I do agree with you. There is a huge discussion on how to deal with exploitation and if boycott is going to be effective to fight against exploitation. I think that's a second clash point. The one that was pointed out by Obillo seems to be more principled, which is, do these people have a moral obligation? Do, even if this moral obligation exists, does there exist, or do these people care enough about that moral obligation to act upon it, or do they don't? And the second one, which is more consequentialist, which is a discussion on, is this boycott going to be effective to help these people that are being exploited by the fashion industry? If this is this going to better their situation, or if it's going to make it worse off? Does anyone think that there is another clash point? I'm going to take that as a no. Perhaps, I do think these are the most important clashes in the debate, but perhaps there is a case to be made that there is a third clash point in which there is discussed an idea of if there are better alternatives to boycotting, which is what we get from government pledge saying this is the only way in which these industries are going to scale down, versus what we get from, for example, opening opposition saying this is not the only way to get exploitation. There is regulation, exactly as Perez is pointing out in the chat. It is likely that there might be regulation. It is likely that these industries have an incentive to regulate themselves or to appear as attractive and as sustainable to their customers in order to seem as a better option in terms of competition with other industries or with other fashion shops. So ultimately, I do think that there might be a third clash point, which is the alternatives and how the teams argue if those exist or not. So that being said, yeah, Chinedum?
Sorry, I think this also existed in the opening half. The clash as to the extent of harm, that's the extent to which exploitation really happens, because I think that's something opening position introduced, but it wasn't so extended to the closing, but I think that happened.
Okay, so I do agree with you. It might be a point in terms of if the problem really exists or not. So basically the idea on, yeah, there is exploitation, but this is the way capitalism works, and it is better to have a job than having no job, even if the job is to some extent exploitative, which was the analysis we get in OO. Perhaps we can put this under the idea of if boycotting is effective or even necessary, which is the question here, which is, do these people even need saving? Like, does exploitation really exist, or do these people already have other ways of fending for themselves? Great, thank you very much, Chinedum, for that contribution. So that being said, I think we have like a clear comprehension of what the clash points were here in the debate. So having those in mind, which is A, moral obligation, B, the effectiveness of boycotting, or if boycotting is even necessary, and third, the alternatives. Let's go through the contributions of each team and how they contribute to each of those clash points, if we think they contribute to all three of them, or if we think that they just contribute to one or two, that's fine, but just let's discuss how they how they enter or interact with those clash points that we have already analyzed or pointed out as important within the debate. So I don't know if someone wants to tell me how they see OG's contribution in terms of those three clash points.
Okay, so if I talk about OG's contribution, first of all, OG's contribution in the very first case around if moral obligation exists, they made it clear that there was a moral obligation, right? But they didn't show why the customers should be able to, should care enough to respect it. I saw the whole, yeah, there is an obligation to ensure that child labor does not continue and people do not keep getting hurt and burnt and all that stuff, right? But why should they care enough? Like, why will they, in this case, care enough to ensure that they boycott? Like, why would they care to take this moral obligation against their personal happiness and joy that fashion gives to them? I think that was a very big part that was missing in OG's case. Now, with regards to with regards to effectiveness of exploitation, yeah, they made good sense, made good contribution around exploitation and how exploitation exists in and of itself, and how it's going to help to reduce the level of exploitation. They made some good level of contribution as regards to effectiveness of reducing exploitation. But where I felt they did not really bring about any proper contribution was on the very third clash, on the alternatives to boycotting. Even the POI was asked around that. They didn't really agree to the fact that it's a case to be considered, right? Whether an alternative should be a case to really be argued in the debate. But even if it's going to be a case, like the deputy prime minister had to talk, it's talked about like the concession of OO, where they talked about regulations and say, okay, yeah, so agreeing that regulations are possible and should be considered, it's more like a concession that exploitation exists. But the effectiveness, the impact, or the necessary alternatives to boycotting, I don't think they really did effective work in that regard. Thank you.
I think it's very important, something that Obi is pointing out here. I think that has to do with the idea of us being active listeners or active actors when we judge a debate. It is not just the fact that we listen to arguments and check if those arguments are substantiated enough, but we have to be active in terms of what is the burden of proof in this motion specifically. As you may see, the motion was this house as an individual of, I probably am not being exact here in the wording, but basically it was this house as an individual of a developed country would boycott fast fashion or would not consume fast fashion. Ultimately, this means this is an actor motion. It is unclear in OG's case in terms of the moral obligation, as Obillo pointed out. It is unclear how is it that people do care about that moral obligation, because it seems like the way the argument in OG is constructed is towards the idea that there is a moral obligation that exists on principle, but there is no explanation whatsoever about why someone who is part of a developed country or a first world country should care about the existence of that moral obligation, which is that last part that is outlined by Obillo, which is yeah, probably you're proving that there is a moral obligation. Probably you're effectively proving that there is a complicit action of the individual when they buy this kind of clothes. They are financing this exploitation. They are like sort of washing or like good washing the industry and saying it's okay to exploit people. But it is unclear why, even if that moral obligation exists, someone should be, or someone from a first world country would care enough to act towards that moral obligation. So that is something that I think it's very important to outline, and that is very, I'd say it's very pristine in showing that most of the times, if we would be just like a passive listener, we would say, oh, there is a moral obligation. They argued about a moral obligation and no one said why that moral obligation did not exist, therefore they are winning. The problem is that even if that argument exists, we as active listeners should not be persuaded because of the motion and the way the motion is phrased. I am going to go through the comments here we have in the chat. I'm going to read them out for the people that are probably watching this video in the future so that they can know what we're talking about. So we have a comment on Perez saying, in terms of the moral obligation, Olo says basically that there is no moral obligation because they are providing employment to third world countries. And basically the comparison is an exploitative work, like in comparison with no work whatsoever. So I'm going to put this down in terms of the contribution of OO in terms of the moral obligation. Second thing that Perez is saying here in the chat is exploitation. They say in terms of the third flashpoint, in terms of alternative, Perez is saying that OO tells us that it is better to have regulation than just having boycott whatsoever. And then Perez says that there is an impact in terms of how is it that boycott is effective in terms of less consumerism and why this is good for the world. Amazing. Thank you very much, Perez, for that contribution. Then we have Bulle saying OJE started off by introducing the fact that there is a moral obligation and that people are more prone to exploitation as a result of fast fashion, only serving more of personal benefits and care less about the others. Great, which basically is an explanation of how that moral obligation is constructed or substantiated in OG's case. Then Bulle says that it promotes a marginalized increase, and in terms of regulation, there are minimum working standards, which ultimately means that there is some sort of a response to OO in terms of why regulation is not likely or why regulation is not enough in these kind of countries, ultimately meaning that probably these people are going to be exploited in either side of the house. Probably regulation is not going to be enough, which ultimately would be a contribution to our idea on alternatives here, why regulation is not effective. And we have Chinedam here saying, OG also adds that the first world citizens push for better labor laws, thus there is kind of an obligation to push for it in other countries, which basically means if you are pushing something inside your country, is likely or it is expected from you to do so in other scenarios, which ultimately means you need to be coherent, and if you're not, then you have a moral obligation to coherence. And then we have Imole here saying OG's contribution to moral obligation is basically that first world consumers are the ones able to make a change. Yeah, I think this is important to point out, which is one of the mechanisms they give in order to say why is it that boycott is going to be effective? So they are the ones that have control. But Imole points out that their analysis wasn't too clear on why and how they weren't too comparative in terms of why is it that someone from the first world has more control or are the ones that are able to make the change, but they established that they had the moral obligation because they have control over it. And they did a good job analysis with the stakeholders, explaining which are the stakeholders that matter most in this debate and why. I think then with that being said, I don't know if someone has another thing to point out from OG or if we should be going towards OO. I'm going to take silence as we're going towards OO. So let's start off with what, bringing back what we got from Perez, which is the idea that OO has responses to moral obligation because they respond that it is likely that even if they're exploited, they would not have otherwise another job. And therefore, this exploitation is like inherent to capitalism, which is then not something people are complicit of or people that or something that people are responsible of, and therefore there is no moral obligation. And secondly, how is it that they are providing employment to these people and therefore they do not have more moral obligation than to provide them with jobs? Anything else on the moral obligation here? We have Bulle saying, started off by rebutting that the working conditions are not that bad as suggested by OG, as the employers are not entirely exploited, as they do meet the working standards, as they are forced to so as a result of the competition in the industry, thus putting more pressure on them to provide better conditions because they are aware that their employers might be poached by others. There are two things that Bulle is pointing out here, which I think are important. The first one is there is explanation in terms of what was pointed out by Chinedum in terms of the clash points, which is, look, there is no necessity to do the boycott because there is not as much exploitation as OG is posing. Why? Because the labor standards are not as bad as OG is saying. And secondly, because there are other mechanisms that are currently in progress that already deal with that exploitation. Those mechanisms might be the idea that I want to keep my workers and I do not want them to go to other other places or to other workplaces in which they have might have better conditions. Secondly, the idea on, as I already pointed out when we were discussing on the clash points, there is also a contribution of OO saying basically that it is likely that that these enterprises want to sell a sustainable and and well-produced product, which is they want to show good practices or best practices in order for their product to be competitive in the first world or whatnot, ultimately contributing to that idea of how is it that there are other alternatives to deal with exploitation, but also saying that that exploitation is not as important. And secondly, Bulle points out here that it added a new point by pointing out that the fast fashion increases the value of fashion industry and innovation, which is something that contributes to the idea on why is it that regulation is better than boycotting, which is the goods or the benefits of fast fashion. Great. Then Obillo says in the comments also showed how consumers are not capable of any exploitation that makes sense and shouldn't prioritize other people's happiness over the fashion satisfaction. I think Obi is pointing out something that is deeply important in this comparison, which is the way in which OO deals with the idea of moral obligation is saying what already WUDC has pointed out, which is, look, there is not an actual moral explanation obligation here. It is likely I am already employing these people. It is likely that these people would be unemployed otherwise, and therefore this is better than the alternative, even if there is some exploitation. I already proved why is it that exploitation is not as bad as OG is pointed out, but there is a second layer of the analysis we get by OO, which is the idea that that Obillo is pointing out here, which is, look, I have already proven to you that the moral obligation is not as important, but secondly, in comparison with the right of like self-actualization or choosing your happiness and your fashion satisfaction is more important than the moral obligation, because A, it is not as big as OG is saying, but B, because people have a right of self-actualization, basically. And then we have Chinedum saying in the comments that OO explains that the people from the first world who patronize fast fashion are those that cannot really access the more expensive brands. Thus, it is equally important for them to be updated and have clothing as it is for them to save the world. Basically, what we already covered. Thank you very much, Chinedum, for pointing this out. Ultimately, what we have here is like a kind of weighing in terms of what is more important for this first world citizen, either the moral obligation or the right to self-actualize and to choose the clothes and the fashions that you want, the clothes and the fashion that you should, that really make you happy. Ultimately, then there is a discussion here on who proves better their principle or who proves better the interest of the individual. Then Chinedum says also that people have the right to access fashion. If boycotted limits that access equally, it is not good, which would be another contribution to the second flashpoint, which is even if the boycott is effective, it is unjust because then people cannot access fashion. Okay, great. Then we have Kushi saying, OO talked about how competition in the market leads to reduction in prices and how due to fast fashion, the top brands will lose the exclusivity of their designs and thus they will have to innovate with new designs. They talked about how competition creates more employment, basically explaining why the boycott would harm the industry in itself because it would go against innovation, it would go against competition, and therefore the market on itself would be less accessible, would be less competitive and less innovative, which basically means less benefits for the consumers as a whole. We have Imole saying here, OO says no moral obligations should exist on customers as long as the means they make money is fair. This is something that is also important, which is, look, the money these people are making is a money well produced, or it is legitimately acquired, which ultimately means they are free to do with their money whatever they want to do with it, and therefore there is no moral obligation in how they should be spending their money, and that they should have access to fashion. Middle-class people do not even have overarching moral obligation to boycott. Their contribution to the clash point on exploitation is that it isn't as bad as OG says it is. and that these workers will be in a worse off state if the boycott happens. Then we have ADO saying, also looked at the lack of better alternatives for the workers in these sweatshops, which ultimately means, look, yeah, we do agree that these people are in bad conditions, but their conditions would be even worse off if the sweatshops did not exist. Then Thank God says, OO pointed out that people have the right to fashion because of the way the society functions, and the people shouldn't care about everything or anything as far as they are happy, which ultimately is the prioritization mechanism to explain why is it that self-actualization or the ability to choose the fashion I want is more important than the moral obligation that OG is pointing out. Kushi says, also talked about the incentive companies have to ensure basic and safe working conditions. We have already covered this in terms of the alternative. Then Prince says, OO believes that restricting access to fashion, which is beneficial to elevating their stance, is not going to prioritize over the happiness of others elsewhere, especially when other alternatives exist to stop these conditions, which ultimately is another prioritization mechanism, which is, look, it is likely that there are other alternatives to work or to solve these problems of exploitation, but this is the only way in which people are going to access a variety of options in terms of fashion, and it is the only way they're going to access fashion. Therefore, it's something that is desirable, and it is something that is more important than the moral obligation that OG is positing in the debate. So, having reviewed all this, I would like for us to briefly take on a stance in terms of who wins this clash point comparing OO to OG. Imole, you think OG wins over OO? Would you care to elaborate? I'm just gonna wait a sec for us to have Imole's thoughts on why OG beats OO, and then we can read or hear out Obillo and Perez on why they think OO beats OG. So Imole says, I think in terms of the contributions to the clashes, OG does a slightly better job than OO. Perhaps Obillo, Perez, or Chinedum, who think otherwise, can chip in and say why they think OO is beating OG.
Can you use voice?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So the explanation from opening government is that these people clamor for better labor laws within their states. So it means that they shouldn't patronize other individuals who do not have better labor laws within their own states. Whereas we have different explanations from what you open your position. First, as to how they do not show the extent of exploitation. So they just say these people are paid less and they're more and everything, to the extent where you don't show how exploited they are. I do not know how sympathetic I am supposed to be to their pleas, first of all, to do those things. Then it then means that if I then realize that first, if I do not know how sympathetic I should be or the extent of harm, and there is a great harm upon me because one, I cannot necessarily buy the better products, because the reason they really patronize fast fashion is because that's what they can really afford. So if I can't afford the better product eventually, and I then fall down in my own circle and I feel sad, and that accessibility is necessarily non-existent, then what is more important to me at that point should be myself and not whoever is being exploited. Also, when opening position says that labor laws aren't really that bad, because I could buy to the extent where you don't explain. So labor laws aren't really that bad within states like it's the 21st century, because all you get from opening government in response to that is that, and that's like the cliche argument everyone would give, that every is because it's what's that state that they use basically. So that's like the only response they give to that particular idea. So the extent where they're able to show how it's the 21st century, sometimes labor laws are relatively better, and these are companies that actually leave the United States with good labor laws and the rest. And then other arguments on how they create better states or livelihood for individuals within those states by giving them jobs that otherwise they wouldn't have gotten. And then the fact that it is my own self and I am equally suffering. So classing myself and my suffering to other individual suffering that I do not necessarily know how great it is, I would necessarily rank opening opposition ahead of opening government under clash.
Thank you very much, Shidam. Susan, you raised your hand. Susan? Okay, I think Susan lowered her hand. So let's go with what we have here in the comments. I believe OO wins because though there are OG established a moral obligation, OO is able to show how it would necessarily not be important to the middle class consumer. So that obligation is not really a priority. And Perez says OO shows how there are lesser harms in the world through the metrics used. Class shows what's in it for marginalized people and third world countries. In the aftermath, while OG only states moral obligation and why workers shouldn't be exploited, but doesn't go ahead to provide a better world for the workers in terms of how they will be treated in the aftermath. So I do agree with most of you in terms of in my assessment of the clash. I do think OO beats OG, and I think Chidodom sums it out in a well explained manner, which is, look, ultimately there is a problem in terms of the burden of proof in this debate, which ultimately is there is no explanation whatsoever about why the moral obligation is more important than the happiness and the self-actualization that people should access through fashion, and therefore it is unclear how that moral obligation is something that is important. But secondly, it is unclear, as I think I forgot who, but someone pointed out, even if there is analysis in terms of OG explaining why the boycott might be effective, because these people are the ones who are able to change the way in which the industry works, it is unclear how is it that these people are effective and how ultimately is it that they are able to ultimately change all the labor standards, which is something that is pointed out by Perez in the comment, which is, it is unclear how is it that the existence of the moral obligation or even the execution of the boycott helps these people in the aftermath when compared to a prioritization that we get from OO, which is, look, happiness is more important than a moral obligation to someone you were not directly related to, or you're not directly affecting, because it is capitalism and not yourself who is affecting them. And also there is enough explanation on how is it that regulation might be enough in most of the cases. But to be fair, there is a case to be made in favor of OG. Like, to be fair to Imole's way of assessing the round, I do think there is a way of seeing that to some extent what OO is doing is not engaging with OG's idea on the moral obligation, because there is no explanation on how is it that they deal with exploitation in their side of the house, especially given all the analysis, examples, and mechanisms we get in OG as to why is it that the situation is urgent and the way in which these people are treated is bad enough for us to understand that probably it is not enough with competition of the market to be able to solve it. So I do think this is the most close comparison in this debate, but I do ascribe to the reasons that have been already said by most of you in terms of why I think OO beats OG. I do not understand how is it that OG has enough material for us to understand that the boycott is going to be effective, but secondly, why is it that these people care a lot about this moral obligation? We have Obio here saying, in simple terms, OG could improve why the consumers should care enough to solve the problem. OO showed how that moral obligation is not necessary over their self-actualization. I do agree with you. I think the most important clash point in the opening half is the idea on moral obligation, if it exists, people should care enough about that moral obligation. Then we have Chuku, I'm going to butcher your name, I'm so sorry. Chukwemeka saying OO's case has a wider reach and more positive effects for the greater number of people. But I have to point something out there in terms of that last comment I read. It is important for you to acknowledge which kind of motion we are assessing, because this is an actor motion, which ultimately means that the impacts on the wider community are not as relevant as the individual impacts of the motion. And for those wider impacts and those impacts that have reached in the whole community to be relevant enough in the debate, there needs to be an explanation of why the actor cares more about those wider impacts than the individual impacts that have been outlined in the debate. I think that's important to note here, because it is always important to acknowledge which kind of motion we are judging, and ultimately then it is unclear why those wider impacts are more important to the individual than the self-actualization one that we have already discussed as a whole. Then let's move on to discuss what are the contributions we get by CG. So I don't know if you want to intervene by voice or you want to comment in the chat, but basically, what do you see as the extension and the responses we get by CG? Okay, so Chinaram says that they did not find an adequate engagement in the clash of moral obligation. We might discuss that a little bit further later. I don't know if someone else has an idea on what is the extension we get on CG. So Perez says, tries to restructure the argument of less consumerism by talking about why less clothes should be sold. So basically, it is an idea on why is it that this boycotting is better for the world, in terms of why is it that this scales down production, how is it that this scales down the harm to the environment and whatnot. Obiya says, I'm not sure where to place their extension on less consumerism. I do agree with you. I think that's an impact on why the boycott is I think there are two layers of this. There is somewhat an explanation we get on CG on why is it that the boycott is going to be effective. And then there's a lot of analysis on why the fact that that boycott is effective is not only good in terms of the exploitation, but in terms of the benefits in terms of less consumerism and less impact on the environment, which ultimately would be an impact in the second clash point, which is the boycott effective? Is the boycott necessary? So I think I would place it in that clash point. We have Perez saying a derivative extension. They talk about how the local industry might benefit. That we can place that also in the second clash point in terms of why boycotting is necessary. Then we have Obiya saying, I think CG spoke more on the mechanism, on the effectiveness of boycotting and helping people make a more rational choice. I do agree with you, Obiya. And I think you're pointing out something that deals with something that was brought out by Chinadum in the comments. I'm going to read these last 3 comments, and then I'm going to tell you what I think it's important of the extension that we get from CG. Imole says, CG had 2 extensions, why the incentives of companies change, ultimately why the boycott is effective, why the sweatshops are bad in their entirety. I think they had good analysis. The impacts of their case were more widespread than OG. I do agree to some extent, but we might discuss this later, that the mechanisms were better than the ones we got from OG. Great. Then we have Perez saying how the workers would still get to keep their jobs when there is less production of clothes, which ultimately means they would not get unemployed, which is a response to what we get from Mobile. Serge says CG does not have an extension of moral obligation specifically. They just engage how the boycott limits bad mass production. And then Kushi says, I feel they completely restructure the debate by establishing why sweatshops will no longer be used for mass production, for which they use 2 layers of analysis. Aggressive sales lead to more buying, quality of clothes goes down, so wear and tear is faster. Okay, so Ali is asking a question here. It says, sorry for pushing you back because of technical problems. My question is, what is the strength of moral obligation, considering the fact that the term is very congested and differs by the extension? I do agree, it is unclear to what extent the moral obligation is important in this debate. And I think this largely accounts to the fact that it is unclear why this moral obligation trumps other moral obligations, such as the moral obligation to fend for your own happiness, or the moral obligation to create employment, or the moral obligation to create a competitive market in the industry. It is unclear, and I think this amounts to how we are going to place and assess the contribution we get in OG. But I do think that this analysis has 2 problems. The first one is that there is no explanation of why this moral obligation trumps all the other things that might intervene or that might exist at the same time in terms of how people should act. But secondly, there is no explanation in OG's case about why people should care or actually care about this moral obligation, ultimately meaning that it is very difficult for us to assess what is the importance of that moral obligation. Ultimately, this is going to amount to how is it that we place OG in this debate. I think it's fair to say that as it is unclear how this is compared to other things said in the debate, it is likely not going to be as relevant in the discussion. So let's go over one of the things most of you have pointed out in the comments, which is that you do not find an actual response or direct engagement with the idea on moral obligations, and basically the idea we get on OO about people having the right to self-actualize and to choose the fashion they want in order to be happy. I think that while there is no direct engagement, I mean, there is no, I am going to directly respond to this argument, I do think that the analysis that we get in CG somewhat deals with this idea. Why is this the fact? Because of something that was pointed out by Obio in one of their comments, which is, why is it that people are actually not making a rational choice? Which ultimately means when CG runs the case on how is it that there is an aggressive marketing that drives people to consume a lot, and how this is bad, and how this does not make them free, how does this actually harm the way in which they make decisions, in which they consume, and how is it that they are largely not being free in their decisions? This is somewhat an answer to the fact that they are therefore not self-actualizing, but what there is being manipulated, which ultimately means that there is no right to self-actualize, that there is no right whatsoever to say that these people are fending for their happiness when they consume this kind of fashion, because this is not a true choice they are making. They are being manipulated, and therefore the right to self-actualize, or the principle of self-actualization that Owo was pointing out, is mitigated by the idea that they are being manipulated. Even if this is not a direct response to the analysis we get on self-actualization by OO, it is enough for us to think that these people are not self-actualizing as much as OO is pointing out, which ultimately reduces the level of impact that the idea on the principle of self-actualization, or the right of self-actualization, had in comparison with OO, which was something that I think it's important to point out, because I think most of the times when we are assessing comparisons, especially in diagonals, we just care about direct responses, but we do not see how is it that the actual material, even the argumentative material that a team brings, how it might even if it's indirectly, how is it that it actually responds to the material, even if it's not flagged as a response, even if it's not flagged as something that directly responds to that. As we are an active listener, we are able to make that match or that interaction accountable, and therefore point it out in the analysis we are making. And I think that's important for us to point out in order to assess what we get from CG. The second thing I wanted to point out about CG's extension here, which is important, is how to assess derivative analysis. Why? Because largely what we get from CG is derivative analysis. They want to prove the same thing that OG wanted to prove. Ultimately, they're not bringing a new comparative to the debate. They're not bringing a new argument to the debate. They're bringing new mechanisms to prove what OG already wanted to prove, which is that, which is why is it that the boycott is going to be effective, and how is it that if the boycott is effective, then we're going to have better impacts for society on and of itself. I want to cover which are the mechanisms that you saw CG added in terms of that. Before that, I'm going to address what Chinerum is saying here in the comments on that argument on how they can get fewer clothing and still be comfortable, then could serve as a response. Also that there are brandless alternatives. Yeah, sure. I think that also can be seen as a response to why is it that people are not going to lose the ability to have other fashion options. Also, there is analysis that we get on CG on how is it that this is going to empower local brands and why this is good on and of itself in terms of the way people interact with their local market, and why that empowers like tiny enterprises or tiny industries in the country. I do agree with you, Chinerum, that those explanations can be seen as a response, even if indirect, to the material on why is it that people are going to still have options and innovation in the fashion industry. So what are the mechanisms you see in CG as to why the boycott is going to be effective? If you want to intervene by voice or want to post it in the chat, you might as well do.
Oh, sorry, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
So before I start, this is a problem I had with the government, because the motion says as an individual, every single analysis on effectiveness was that many individuals to do that, then production is driven down and everything. So I also wanted to ask the question, because somehow opposition did not also point that out and kind of allowed the analysis to flow. So all the arguments on how production, especially closing opposition, they just talked about how production is going to be driven down and then it causes another trickle down problem and everything. So that's what I got. But with the idea of how it's going to happen, I think CG said with the same idea that production is going to be driven down because many individuals are going to boycott, and then it's going to lead to them re-strategizing, that is to create better scenarios in the workplace, etc., etc. Because they try to throw a different line, because opening government says that production is going to go down, so these people are going to leave since they are like multinationals and something. Closing government tried to say that they are most likely not going to leave because they're getting something from these countries, but then they would just stay and re-strategize and try to do things better within those states. Even though it looked like they were scared to make the analysis because they didn't say it for a really long time. They didn't try to flesh it out at all. I think that's what they said on like effectiveness.
So let's start off with the first thing you pointed out, which I think is very important to be aware of, which is this is a motion of one person doing one thing. Then it is unclear how is it that those large impacts are going to happen. Then if we are aware of that, and it is okay to be aware of that, why? Because you have to assess how substantiated something is. It is clear to an intelligent voter, which is this standard we have as per the WUDC manual. It is clear to an intelligent voter that one person cannot change the whole industry. That is clear and reasonable for an intelligent voter to understand. But the problem is, look, that all teams in the debate are to some extent going forward with the idea that the boycott is going to be generalized. OG says it, you're going to be able to change the industry. O says, look, but changing the industry is bad because then you do not have a right to self-actualize, then you do not have innovation, you do not have competition in the market, ultimately thinking that a lot of people is going to do it. Then we have CG also thinking that a lot of people is going to do it. And lastly, we have CO saying, look, if people do so, this is going to be bad because then these industries are going to go towards the middle-income countries or the middle-income consumers from developing countries, and this is going to be worse off. Ultimately, then all teams seem to agree that this is not going to be made by just one individual, but by a large amount of individuals. And again, as per the WDC manual, we have to judge the debate that happened, not the debate that should have happened. And ultimately then, if all teams somewhat agree that there is a large number of people that are going to make this decision, then we have to analyze who substantiates better which consequences are worse. But I do think, Chinedum, that you pointing this out is very important, because this is some things that we have to care about when giving OAs, saying, look, it is important for you to acknowledge that you were talking about something that was not accounted for in the motion, or perhaps in individual feedback for the teams, perhaps explaining to them how is it that they have to be careful about that, and being aware of those things is important. Perhaps if not all the teams had based their analysis on a lot of people making this decision, then it would be a different case scenario in which if just one team starts off on the fact that most of the people are going to make the decision, but all the other teams just talk about one person making the decision, then probably the other team would be out of scope and then not as relevant in the debate. This is not the case for the debate we're judging as of now, but I think it's very important for you to point that out. Then we have Imole saying their argument on diversification was good in my opinion. If sweatshops leave, then the government has to diversify and create better jobs for the people, which takes care of exploitation in a way. But as Shinedon points out, their large impact is not something you get from an individual. However, if it becomes generalized, then there's a chance that they could propose from CG that could happen. And then we have Chukwu Meka saying, I think in the debate we have the liberty to think on a large scale. That could be thinking in terms of number of consumers. That's fair. I think in the debate that actually we watched, that is something that happened. They were saying like a large number of people are going to make these decisions, and all teams seem to agree on that fact. I want to address the question we got from Chukwu Meka here in terms of if you should, when a motion suggests the action of only an individual, you're not at liberty to think about the aggregate effect. There are two things to point out here. First, this is an actor motion, which means that what we only care about is if the action fulfills the interest of the actor in question, which is, if the motion is this house as Juanita would eat an ice cream, the motion is not about if the world would be better if I ate an ice cream, but whereas if my interests are better fulfilled when I eat an ice cream. If I want to talk about the aggregate effects, then I have to explain why Juanita would care about the fact that there is an aggregate effect. So I explained, Juanita is an altruistic person, a person that cares about saving the world, and that's what makes her happy. Therefore, if we prove an aggregate effect, then this fulfills Juanita's altruistic interests. But secondly, if we're going to prove how this changes the world, how this solves hunger, then we have to prove how my own action of eating an ice cream is going to have a snowball effect, or how is it that I am so important that my own action is going to have an aggregate effect. Those two things need to be proven for the argument to be relevant enough in the debate. In this case, it was then important, which was not a thing that happened in either of the teams of the debate, which is, why is it that just one individual from the middle class of a first world country deciding to boycott a fashion industry or the fast fashion industry would mean that a lot of people would make the same decision? Or how is it that it is likely that I am going to convince other people or whatnot? Does this make sense, Chukwumeka? Does this make sense? Yeah, okay, great. So let's go towards the new mechanisms that were pointed out by Chinedum in terms of on how is it that CG addresses the fact of a more effective boycott. So what basically we get on CG is the idea on how is it that CG explained how is it that there is a threat of moving out, how is it that there are incentives of the politicians to change the jobs that are being offered to these people when the fast fashion industries leave the country because they do not have now the profit enough to sustain their own industry, and how is it that then it is likely that they are going to have better jobs. The question here then is, and I think it is very enlightening to have this discussion in terms of when is a derivative extension enough to win over the upper half here? And I think the question you have to make when you're assessing a derivative extension is either does the new extension or the new mechanisms bring a higher level of impact, or does the new mechanization lead to me being more persuaded that something is likely, or it amounts to a bigger probability of something happening? If the answer is yes, then the mechanisms or the derivative extension is enough to win over the opening half, which ultimately means when I see a derivative extension, I have to answer, does this make the opening half arguments more relevant? Does this make the arguments from the opening half more likely? If the answer is yes, then it is something that is relevant enough for me to say that CG is taking it over OG. In this case, specifically, then we have to assess if the mechanisms given by CG in terms of the effectiveness of the boycott are enough to say that they are winning over CG. What do you guys think about that comparison between OG and CG? So we have Perez here saying CG over OG. We have Imole agreeing with Perez. We have Kushi agreeing as well. Obio. I think then we have like a unanimous way of understanding this debate, which is we think that the mechanisms of CG in terms of effectiveness were more relevant or more persuasive than the ones we got from OG. And I think it's very important because look, that we're saying that the mechanisms, and Chinedom is pointing out here in the chat that the mechanisms on effectiveness were better than the ones that OG gives. We have already said that it is unclear to us how the moral obligations amount in this debate, and therefore it is likely that the most important thing that we had in OG is how to deal better with exploitation. And as we think that CG mechanizes this better, gives it more likeliness or more probability, then as it was the thing that we amount for more importance in comparison between OG and CG, then we do think that the mechanisms that we get from CG are far more persuasive than the ones we got from OG. Lastly, let's cover CO. What is the contribution we get from CO? And let's compare that to CG in the debate. If you want to intervene by voice or want to post it in the chat, that's fine. So we have Perez saying CO talks about how moral obligation isn't necessary for people as they live in a status quo that already judges them for their fashion choices, and also alludes to the fact that there is a strong power in status quo that makes people get influenced involuntarily. As for boycotting, fashion trends won't stop by us boycotting, rather it could spark aggressive marketing from corporate due to a fear of losing out on consumers who buy their products. Anything else that you want to add there? Someone else either than Perez, but I think Perez covered it out in a well manner. Imole says CO does a great job of extending why self-actualization trumps moral obligation and properly explains why consumers will make certain choices. Yeah. I do think the analysis on why there is no moral obligation is not only in terms of, and I think Perez also points this out, it's not only in terms of how is it that there is no moral obligation, but also that even if I am not self-actualizing towards fashion, it is the only way I can I do not know this word in English, but like how to uplift socially yourself. Ultimately, this means if the society works by fashion standards, even if I wanted to do so or not, right? If this is true, then the question is, do I have a moral obligation to go against those fashionist standards and then not being able to uplift socially myself? Or whereas, do I have a bigger moral obligation with myself to uplift myself socially through my fashion choices? Because it is inevitable that I am going to be measured by my fashion choices, which is the sort of explanation we get from CO in terms of why is it that that moral obligation of fighting towards exploitation is not as important in this debate. What we get for Prince says that CO discusses more on the prioritization of self-actualization over any other moral obligation. I want to address that because I think Prince is right on that. I think there is a clear weighing mechanism that we get in CO, which is the analysis that even if there is two moral obligations, one to self-actualize or uplift myself socially or respond to the fashion standards that society is going to impose with me in either side of the house, even if those moral obligations exist at the same time, even if, which is a good even if that is pointed out by CO, there is an explanation on how is it that I have more control over my social upliftment than control over the exploitation that people have in third world countries or sweatshops. Ultimately meaning that even if both moral obligations exist in reality, what CO is arguing is that one moral obligation is more achievable than the other, and therefore that is what should decide the debate, which is something I find very interesting and very persuasive in CO's case, which is why is it that self-actualization or self-upliftment is more important than the moral obligation of fighting exploitation that we get from OG? Thank God says that CO talks about how these consumers are not just rich people, but they can also be middle-class people, and how these companies' policies are worsened. And then how is it that these people have a less ability to access the market, and how not only accessing the market is something that is harmful, as OO pointed out, in terms of their self-actualization, but in terms of their ability to climb socially. Serge says CO engaged self-actualization that middle-class people will lack, and this is a trend that they cannot control, which is something important, right? They are going to be asked to be fashionable in either side of the house because they cannot control the fact that that is something that society cares a lot about right now. And they say that it affects middle-class people more, and then it is that. Obvious says CO gave a clearer explanation on how middle class needs the self-actualization in a case where they find it difficult to access higher fashion options, which is true. They made the moral obligation argument more persuasive than OO. I do agree with this. And perhaps something that was pointed out by Perez in the first comment on what is CO's contribution here, which is, I think that there is also an explanation on how is it that if there is a boycott against fast fashion, it is unlikely that what fast fashion is going to do is change their corporate attitudes or policies. It is likely that what they're going to do is ultimately be more aggressive in their marketing, be more aggressive towards middle-class individuals, towards other people from other countries, and therefore this is going to be worse off in terms of the self-actualization and the liberties of these people. They are not going to make rational choices, because if the publicity or the merchandising is bad enough as it is likely that it's going to be worsened when there is a boycott that they want to fight against. So ultimately, there is also some kind of engagement with CG there in terms of how is it that even if there is aggressive marketing, that aggressive marketing is going to be even worse if there is a boycott. So to start closing off here, I think it's important then to, for transitivity, and because we have already been here for an hour and 45 minutes, I think it's important for us to go faster. So we're going only to discuss the comparison here between CO and CG, as we already agreed that CG beats OO and CG beats OG. Then we only have to discuss if CO ultimately beats CG or not. before addressing that, I'm going to read out what Prince contributes in the chat, which is CEO also argues that even where boycotting is effective, brandless names cannot be called out. This is very important, and I do agree with you, Prince, on this. There is explanation on why is it that it is better to have these brands clear in these scenarios. A, because it is easier to make them accountable, and B, because it is better to be clear on who are you buying for and what chain of production is that industry contributing to, in order to make them accountable or hold them accountable for what they are doing in the industry, which I think it's very important in terms of how is it that we can deal with exploitation better, which is also a response to what we get from all the government bench. And then Obius says, CEO also showed the negative effect of the more aggressive ads option that boycott would cause, as fast fashion industries will have to find a way around to maintain a profit margin. Likely they're going to be more aggressive in other markets, or they're going to be aggressive towards poor people or other kind of people that are driven to always buy for them. I do agree with this, and there is explanations. And then how is it that this boycott is going to worsen off the situation for all the individuals? So being clear on those comparisons, then who do you think wins in the comparison between CG and CO, and why is that? So Obia says here CO over CG. Perhaps you can type out why you think that is so. So we have Imole saying CO because they engage the motion as an actor motion better. I do think, and I agree with this in terms of what Imole is pointing out. I think that there is an explanation of why is it that people in the middle class or even in the upper class care a lot about their social mobility, and how is it that this is the most important thing that they care about, or this is the bigger interest in their lives, and therefore I do think that CO is better able to explain why is it that they are going to care more about this than any other factor. Perez says CO over CG because of their practicality and showing that even if what CG claims to be true, they show adverse effects. I do agree with this. I think what Imole is saying is very true. They engage better with the actor interest, but also they are able to sort of flip the argument that is given by CO, saying that it is likely that if the aggressive ads or the aggressive merchandising that these fashion industries already do is bad enough, when they are boycotted, instead of like de-escaling the way in which they exploit workers, it's likely that what they're going to do is even worse aggressive marketing, explaining how is it that then boycott is going to lead to worse effects. Imole says they were also able to show how CG harms do not go away, which is something that already we covered. Obia says the explanation on why they actually have no moral obligation to act against their personal satisfaction, and the spiral down effect of boycotting, which could affect more lower class consumers, and third world compromises, which the entire government wants to protect. Ultimately, they explain how is it that they even win in all the government bench metric, which is where do you deal better with exploitation? Well, where do you deal better with aggressive marketing, which was the things that GovBench cared about, ultimately winning in both like in both of the metrics that were discussed in the debate. Chukwumeka says, while CG strengthens the moral obligation better, the bigger burden of the consumer interest is handled by CO, and the counterfactual of the CG is equally made clear by stating the effects of boycotting. I do agree with you. And Princess, I think CO over CG because they show how boycotting has more harms and how moral obligation is not necessarily important to the actor. Thus, what would be the incentive to boycott? I do agree with all of you. I think CO is the better team to explain what are the interests of the actors, but also how is it that the boycotting would have a worse effect if we do care about the wider impacts in the debate, which is unclear if it's something that is important or not in the debate on and of itself. But I do think that CO is able to win in both of the metrics, and therefore wins over CG in this case and over all of the other teams in comparison. Trinadom says a combination of moral obligation argument with the clarity on how these companies have a better alternative to depending on the first world for profits. And Trinadom also says CG needed to at least show how important the first world market is to these companies, which is true. It had to explain why is it that if the first world market was going to boycott them, how is it that they would scale down instead of just turning towards other markets and being more aggressive towards those, which is what we get from CO. So basically, I think through this discussion, we have reached a call in which we're giving the first to CO, the second to CG, the third to OO, and the fourth to OG, being third and fourth very close and having ways of explaining either way, but being more persuaded by the explanation of why OO beats OG. So basically, this was a bit of a guided discussion on a panel. I think the most important things that you should take on this is first what we discussed on how to analyze extensions, how to assess derivative extensions, and how to say if they are winner extensions or not. The analysis on engagement, even if it's not direct, how to assess it and how to explain how a team directly or indirectly responds to another team. I think it's very important. And look, that's something that I think it's very important to be aware of is the fact that it is always important for you to be very precise in terms of what is the actual thing you're referring to when saying one team is more persuasive than others. And I'm going to flag things out. For example, it is different to say, I think CO was better able to explain the interest of the actors. That is somewhat of a broad explanation that is not precise in terms of what happened in the debate, in comparison with saying when CO addresses the need of people to uplift themselves socially in a world that is going to care about fashion in either side of the house, they address the most important interest of the actor that is more relevant than the moral obligation that was not grounded towards the interest of the actor. Look, that even if I took a little more time in the second explanation, that's an explanation that shows that I listened to the debate and that I'm seeing the interaction. And that is something that is very important for you to show which mechanisms are you taking into account and which is the tipping point for you to be persuaded over another team and not just saying, I found more persuasive this or I think it was better explained. You have to explain which are those mechanisms and how those mechanisms are effective to show what you're persuaded about. I think those are the most important things that I think you should be taking on from this panel discussion. I do think that this panel discussion was reflective that you guys have learned a lot about judging this past week. I do think that your contributions and your intake of what happened in the debate was very helpful in advancing the discussion. And therefore, I think you're going to do a very good in the panel discussions that you're going to engage with in the future. I do not know if you have any questions, if you want to further discuss something. If not, then I think we're done for today. And thank you very much for bearing with me these almost 2 hours. You're welcome.
Okay, so I think that there are not much questions in the chat. I'd like to say a very big thank you to you, Juanita. I think you had a lot of energy. That was like some power-packed 2 hours of deliberation there. I want to think that everyone who has been part of the session has also strongly benefited from it as well. So we can't say enough thank yous to you. And yeah, I think the chat is just full of appreciation. All right, so guys, thank you very much for coming around, and hopefully we'll see you guys next year. I think I'm just going to end the recording. Then we're going to get into the attendance, just so we confirm from the names that we already had, the people who had been in this particular session. So, but once again, thank you very much, all of you who have also been joining us on YouTube. Thank you also for keeping pace with us, and we hope that the materials have been very sufficient in helping you improve your adjudication